So welcome everyone. It's right at 7 o'clock and I want to make sure we start and end on time. Thank you for being here. Delighted to have you with us tonight. This is one of my favorite topics because it's a part of ethics, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. I'm Hank Lewis, for those of you who don't know me. I am a licensed Unity teacher at CCU Orlando. I'm also the LUT representative to the Southeast Region Board of Directors, and I'm also on the Unity Worldwide Ministries LUT ministry team. That's my side jobs. My day job, no, I'm joking, none of those are real jobs. My day job is that I'm the Assistant Director of Academic Program Quality at the University of Central Florida. We are the accreditation people. So I've learned that people love me or hate me. You never know on what day it's going to be. But it's actually something I enjoy because that also has a lot to do with ethics. I'm the affiliated faculty member in Women and Gender Studies at UCF. So I have a wide range of interest in my world. Former professor of business management and ethics, and was also a Southern Baptist minister for over 20 years. Before leaving there and going to a metropolitan community church where I spent another 9 years, and then found Unity. On an Enneagram, I'm a 1. So if you know anything about the Enneagram, that's the reformer. The reformer is the one whose basic fear is being corrupt or evil. We can't stand the thought of being defective. And as my therapist says, I don't have to be right, but I just can't ever be wrong. And there's a fine line between those and can get you into a lot of intelligent discussions along the way. Brigg, I'm INTJ, which is the architect, and I am a Capricorn, if that means something to you. I was born on Christmas Day at 3:02 in the morning in the year of the dog. That's really just about everything there is to know about me. I do have rapid automatic naming dyslexia. Wish that had been diagnosed when I was in school as opposed to once I was done with all of my education and degrees. But that just means that if I look at a piece of paper, it takes me a long time to figure out what those letters are. So I don't just look at a page and see words necessarily. I just see a jumble of letters. And if I stare at it long enough, it'll become intelligent words to look at. So for tonight, we're going to look at values and ethics, at living our authentic life, being our authentic self, establishing boundaries in dealing with others and with ourselves. Examine the effects of weak boundaries, create clear guidelines for establishing boundaries. And then we're also going to look at 2 ways of determining boundaries or creating boundaries for your own life. And before we get too far into it, I invite you to join me in a moment of meditation and prayer, please. So if you'll just calm yourself, take 2 deep breaths together. And then as you're comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes. Divine love living in and expressing through us. Peace is the very heart of God. All life is created through the power of divine love to live in peace. Peace is the harmonious nature of life. It exists in the deep stillness of the timeless presence of our oneness. This peace is perfect, complete, and infinite. Joy flows out of this perfect peace. Love flows out of this perfect peace. Hope flows out of this perfect peace. The peace that is at the very heart of God lives in me and in you. The Christ presence expressing in me and through you. We are peace. And I invite you to take that now into a time of silence.
Or is it not doing anything? Okay.
And as you bring yourself back into this time, this present moment, know that you are indeed peace, love, hope, and joy. So it is. So as I said, I used to teach this for a living, and then started teaching it for a group of ministers in the Southeast region. And I always start with this set of disclaimers. Everything you already knew long before you logged in tonight, but just to go over them again. I can't tell you what boundaries you need to set in your life. There's no way. You know you, I don't. I can't write your boundary statements for you. That's going to be up to you. I don't know the details of your individual situation, and I always make sure I say right up front, I am not a licensed counselor. And then the last one is, I can't ensure that anyone will respect your boundaries, including you. So as we go through this, just kind of keep those in mind as we go through. So because there's a small enough number of us tonight, I'm going to ask some questions. And when I do, if you would like to answer, just unmute yourself, say your name, and then tell us what your answer is to the question if you're comfortable doing so. But I'm not going to do the raise your hand thing. I'll be honest, I'm really lousy at checking the chat box. So it's way easier if you just unmute yourself and interrupt me, and we'll just keep right on going. It won't offend me or bother me in the least. So here's the first question. How would you define or describe the word ethics? What does ethics mean to you? Anyone? How would you define ethics?
Hank, this is Rory.
All right.
I would describe it as like moral obligations. That's how I would say it, moral obligations.
Okay, thank you, Rory. Anyone else?
This is Tammy. For me, it was like, I thought, do the right thing, whatever, do the right thing. But then when I thought it, I'm like, oh, that could really be up to the interpreter. But for me, do the right thing.
All right, thank you, Tammy.
I'm Jean Marie, and I've always believed in ethics as being, I try to apply the do unto others as you would have done unto yourself in the ethics description or definition. I work in an office, and having that in the forefront of my mind as being one of the ways to provide or to do business in an ethical way. And I guess that's it.
Great, thank you, Jean Marie.
Good night, this is Luana.
Hi, Luana.
Hi, excuse my English if you don't understand me. I speak a little fast, so for me, ethics, yeah, ethics is the way you act and react and the way you live, not only your life around you, between your family, neighborhood, community, is in your work too. It's the way you react and act certain things that happening and the way you are in front of everybody. Being honest and being open about it, not only for yourself, but for the others to see too.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
So let's switch to another word. What about integrity? How would you define integrity for you?
To do unto, I'm Jean Marie, I'm sorry. To do unto others, regardless of how you know they'll do unto you. I'm not trying to be silly, but I know my workplace and I have a few people in mind when I say that.
I understand. Anyone else? Integrity, or maybe how integrity relates to ethics.
Well, I think for me, well, integrity means standing in the truth of what's right, whether standing up for what's right. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. That's kind of, I don't know how to express what I want to say, but that's kind of what it is for me.
Cool. Thank you, Tammy.
Hello, this is Anna.
Hi, Anna.
Integrity, that word for me this year, I was thinking about that and I thought to myself, I want to be honest with, with myself. So like I won't, so if I say, tonight I'm going to walk or whatever, for exercise or my self-health, that I would honor the promises that I make to myself. So I wanted to have integrity with myself. So it's like how I related to ethics is that I know that there's like a framework, a blueprint, which is my ethics, and my integrity is how aligned in my behavior I am to the blueprint, to my ethics. Thank you.
Thank you. So those are all excellent answers, and they're all the right answers. One of the cool things when you look at ethics and you look at integrity is it's all about you. What is necessarily ethical for me, you might totally disagree with. In many workplaces that I have been along my career, I have not always agreed with what was ethical that other people thought was perfectly fine to do. Working in higher education for 35 years, you meet some very interesting people. And they have their ethics, I have mine. The catch then becomes, can we work together with that? But if you look at the quote definitions, ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. A set of moral principles, which is what every one of you said, relating to or affirming a specialized group, field, or form of conduct. Basically, for me, ethics is a code of conduct that I choose to live by, or in some cases, like UCF has a code of conduct we have to sign off on every year. Unity has a code of conduct, most companies do, that you say these are the minimum standards that I'm going to enforce in doing business here. Integrity is your personal code. If you're going to live integrity, then you're going to live exactly who you are. It goes above whatever that code might be, the ethical code that you're agreeing to. For me, that's just like going, as it says, above the letter of the law, the letter of the of good conduct, and encompassing the spirit of good conduct as well. I think when people think of whether or not they can count on you, then it's your integrity that they're thinking about. They're able to see who you are and you're consistent with who you are. So while ethics may be a code of conduct for a group or something, to me, integrity is completely about me. And what is my integrity? So one of my favorite sources for things is Facebook, just because I love memes on Facebook. I have learned to enjoy Facebook now that I've decided not to be anything other than who I am on there. So for those of you who are my friends, you're not going to see political stuff. You're not going to see all kind of other odd stuff. It's just me being me. And if you do see me post something that kind of goes off from what you might have thought, you'll know it was something that was very meaningful to me. But these were on integrity. Integrity is choosing your thoughts and actions based on values rather than personal gain. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. I've seen that one a few hundred times on Facebook, I think. Integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy, and choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them. So those are some of my favorites. And if you take your ethical stands and you take living in integrity, then that's where you can start putting your boundaries together. So a boundary is a line or a mark that limits an area or a dividing line. The definition I like most is the bottom one, and I hope you can read it on your slide. But it says norms, rules, or code characterize an individual's personal space or environment and their sense of security and safety. Healthy boundaries provide a nurturing and safe physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual environment for individuals. I like the picture of the fence because it's one of those pictures where it's definitely a boundary. You know that you're on one side, somebody else might be on the other. It definitely keeps things on their side of the fence. But most fences you can get over or around or through. And what we'll talk about later on is that sometimes we kind of bend our boundaries just a little bit. We say, this is what I will and won't do, but then maybe we will make some exceptions for the different things. One of the things I find most interesting when discussing boundaries is that we don't know each other's boundaries. I have no clue what your boundaries are, especially when I first meet all of you. It's not like there's a big sign that you wear that says, these are my boundaries. So I will just share one that I think is really interesting because at CCU, people hug a lot. And I have a friend who won't go to church there specifically because people hug a lot. And they really want to wear a sign that says, please don't, but they aren't quite that comfortable. And I get that. We each have our personal boundaries. So, you know, what I've encouraged them to do is either you can remain seated during that time when people greet each other, though that time may be gone now for quite a while. Or you can just stick out your hand, or you can just stand there and smile at people. But, you know, we don't know that when we first meet people. Our boundaries are kind of like those invisible bubbles that are floating around. So we want to be sure that when we set our boundaries, we honor not only our own, but the boundaries of others. So we'll talk a good bit more about that. One of my favorite pictures that I found on boundaries is on this next slide. I'm not sure I would go that far with boundaries, but I get it. So boundaries are consistent, realistic, and establish that certain behaviors cannot come in and will not go out. So if you take that in a very literal sense, then you can build your fence around yourself and try to live that way. And in some of my areas where I have boundaries, that's very true. They don't bend, I don't move, they're there. They're not going anywhere, and I'm not going to make exceptions with them. And almost all of us have some of those ironclad boundaries along the way. Boundaries are a physical or emotional limit that a person defines as safe or appropriate, are consistent, reliable, established that certain behaviors cannot and will not go in and out, said that. Take time and effort to maintain, that's very true, boundaries are work. And this is another of my favorites, are high maintenance for people who have them. People with unhealthy boundaries are high maintenance for others who interact with them. So boundaries are high maintenance for people who have them because you have to work on them and we have to maintain them. And then people with unhealthy boundaries are high maintenance for the rest of us. So we learn at some point who those high maintenance people are with their boundaries, who don't honor yours or theirs. And that's a part of what we're going to talk about is how we deal with some of those people. But that'll be actually in next week's class. So one of the ironclad things with me, one of the first jobs I had with a church was with a Southern Baptist church in Georgia. And they didn't have any more offices left. And I was hired as their worship leader and youth pastor. And they had nowhere to put me. So they created an office for me in a separate building. I was maybe 24, 25 years old at that time, but I had a really good mentor who told me the first thing I needed to do was to set some boundaries around being in that other building. So while it seemed kind of foolish at that time, the older I've gotten and the more I've dealt with people, the more I understood. So the first thing I had them do was take off that solid wood door and put up a glass door. So that at any point in time, anybody who walked by my office could see me in there and see that I was right in there by myself. The second part of that boundary was to tell them that when they made an appointment for me to meet with a youth parent or one of my musicians or something, someone in the choir or something, that someone from the main office would be over there with me the entire time. And if you can't do that, then tell them I'll meet them in one of the other offices over in the main building. And basically, most people understood the point after a little while. And that was one of those where I didn't bend. These are boundaries I'm sticking to. And honestly, it was for my protection and the church's protection. You just don't put yourselves in situations which might end up backfiring on you. And most people think that would never happen at a church. But after some 30 years of working for them, it would. So I try to be very careful with those boundaries. Some of my other boundaries are a lot more flexible. So like I always say that I'm not going to work at a certain point in time, but reality is, pardon? So reality is, for me anyway, that sometimes those boundaries bend because of what I do in the 5th year and the 10th year of our affirmation of our accreditation. You can spend a whole night at work. So I might go in the morning, sleep for 2 hours and go back in. And normally I would never do that. But I have found that during those 2 points of time over that 10-year span, it's kind of necessary. So I am willing to bend my boundaries at that point in time. That's one of the exceptions I'll make. It's not like I'm going to dig the post up and change my whole boundary system, but I will make some exceptions along the way. I also, when I worked for a church, for a different church, I was their person in charge of pastoral care. And I would go visiting because I was only part-time once a week to go visit people who were in the hospital or who were shut in or who needed to visit. And it was amazing how many of those people's schedule did not match with mine. They didn't get sick and go in the hospital on the day I was available. And while that sounds silly, it really became an issue of just how many times during the week will I break my go once a week and not end up there 7 days out of the week trying to see people. And what I learned really quickly was when I tell people, you know, I do have another job and I will get there as quickly as I can, they were understanding with that. The exception would be if it was an emergency situation. And at that point, you do what you need to do and you go deal with it. One of the things that made it easy then that wouldn't be now is I was single at that point in time. So the only person it was affecting if I changed those boundaries were me and my sleep patterns. But you do that when it's something that matters. So boundaries are influenced by a lot of things. Culture is one of them. The family that you grew up in, your family of origin, has a lot to do with the kind of boundaries that you have. Many of my boundaries are based on my parents, good and bad. So there are things I've kept and things that have moved along with me the entire time of my life. A lot of them have to do with the religious place that you grew up or who your spiritual leaders were at that time. I've worked with ministers who were gone almost the entire day and then would be gone during the evening for some kind of meeting and then tried to figure out why their children had issues. And in some cases hadn't seen them in quite a while. But you need to know what your boundaries are. And I find that most of our boundaries are based on our values. So what is it that you value in life? What is most important to you? What is it you believe about life and work and what work-life balance kind of things? Values determine our priorities. So what are some of the boundaries that you have that are based on your values? That's a hard question. So just some easy ones. In my job, I am very focused on details. So that is a value for me. So my boundary is nothing goes out of my office that I haven't checked at least twice. Nothing goes out of the office with my name on it if somebody else wrote it that I haven't checked at least twice. I am very careful about those kind of things. Being honest to me is important. I don't want anybody to ever say I bent the system or tried to maneuver around the system. We sometimes joke that we do creative accreditation, creative compliance kind of stuff, but you do. And part of that you're trying to do is just to make sure that everything that has been done can be explained. And if it can't, then you just own up to it and you move on. Meeting deadlines is important to me at work, being positive at work. Some of my personal core values, I don't know what yours are, happiness, honesty, again, community is important to me. Spirituality is important to me. So what kind of things are important to you? What kind of values do you have?
For me, honesty is for me. Spirituality also. Trying to be lovable, trying to be loving, and I value love.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Dove. I think that values are really like you want to respect people like you respect yourself. Those are values. Like I would treat people the way I want to be treated.
Thank you, Dove. Yeah, and I think that goes back also to what Jean Marie said earlier, is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you type of principle. Anyone else? What are your values?
I think of family, spirituality for me, and self-worth are some of my values.
Okay, thank you, Roy. So one of the things I want you to do is to take a second and jot down what your values are. Not everybody is going to say them out loud, and that's perfectly fine. Just jot down what 3 or 4 of your values are in life. And then hang on to that for a minute, and we'll talk about them more later on. So what are some of your values?
Highest Dove. One of my values is you support other people and serve other people. That's one of my values that I admire.
Thank you, Dove. All right, so hang on to those things that you wrote down, and we'll look at them in a minute. Brene Brown is one of my favorite people, favorite authors, because she came out of an academic background, and I love that she can be so blunt and so truthful and hit me right between the eyes most of the time. And these are kind of hard to see, I think, probably on your screens, but the first one says, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others. And then the other one, when we fail to set boundaries and hold people accountable, we feel used and mistreated. And I think both of those are true, and both of those are things that most of us have experienced somewhere along the way in our life. So how do we avoid that? So here's some basics about boundaries. Relationships are complex. I know this is earth-shattering news for everyone on here. None of you understood before tonight that relationships were complex. But I want to throw that out because they simply are. And because for most of us, love and friendship and community are part of our value system. But making them all work together when you mix in home and work and social and church and anything else that you're involved in can get really complicated. This is where you look at a value of trying to be loving, trying to be a friend to everyone. But at the same time, you have to look at the boundary of time. How much time can you give to everything in your life? For me, that's caused me along the way to say, okay, I need to stop doing this. While this might be important, it's less important than some of the other things in my life. But boundaries, relationships are complex. If people see you in a leadership role at your office or your work or in anything, they tend to think they know you. Interestingly, I work with a lot of people whose face I know and names I can't remember. Now, in my individual office, there's only 7 of us, so I know all of them quite well. But in the office right next door, there's about 42 people in that office area. I have finally now, after 4 years, learned all of their names. It's just not my gift in the world to remember sometimes. But it becomes complicated, but they think they know you. People always just assume that they know stuff about you. That's especially true with people who are upfront all the time, especially with ministers, honestly. People think that they know an awful lot about you just based on what you've shared with them. But reality is nobody knows anything about others except what they have chosen to share with us. There's that meme that says, be gentle with people because you don't know what they're dealing with, sort of thing. And that's reality. We don't know. If they haven't told us, we don't know. For workaholics, boundaries are very difficult. So all of you workaholics listening to me will work on those and come up with some boundaries. Boundaries do build better self-esteem. When you know that you have a boundary in place, then you don't have to sit and think about how you're going to react to answer something. You know your answer. So it builds your self-esteem to know that you have boundaries and people aren't going to walk over you and people aren't going to manipulate you and use you. Boundaries conserve emotional energy. Yeah. You know what your boundary is. You don't have to sit and think about it and put all this energy into coming up with how to respond to something. Setting boundaries is a long-term project. Please remember that through this whole conversation. You have to educate people and you have to create advocates, and we'll talk a little more in detail about that. But that is a huge part of setting boundaries, and it takes a while. You can write down 3 boundaries tonight that you're going to stick to. But now you have to educate everybody else about what those boundaries are and how you're not going to cross them. And that takes time and that takes a lot of energy. Setting boundaries is risky. It requires real strength and determination because every time you set a boundary, somebody's going to be offended or hurt. Unless it's a very basic boundary. Because often it means you're not going to do something somebody else thinks you should be doing. It's just part of life. Welcome to it, sorry. But reality is it is a risky thing to do. Boundaries can be flexible. So again, sometimes you can bend them and change them around. A lack of boundaries is described in numerous articles and in research as the #1 problem in most people's lives. Some of the most interesting research, because again, I teach this with ministers now, and some of the most interesting research is that 80% of ministers' spouses, partners, wish their partner did anything other than ministry. And 70% of ministers who start in ministry 5 years later will be gone. To me, that's just fascinating. I think it's also true, and I've tried to find the research that is out there on teachers. When you look at what some of our public school teachers go through on a daily basis, then the great majority of them don't stay in the field. And I can't remember what the number is, but it is just an area where more boundaries are needed. People helping and people pleasing can eat away at your personal and family time so subtly that you don't even know it's happening. I don't know. I'm not going to ask people to raise their hands if you're a people pleaser online or if you're a people helper. But I got to tell you, Unity attracts a lot of people pleasers and people helpers. So you just have to be very careful with your boundaries and set them. You're not required or supposed to become all things to all people ever. And then this is my favorite line from the whole presentation, honestly. Being a ministry worker or people pleaser is like being a stray dog at a Whistler's convention. Because every time somebody whistles, you run. We have to please. We have to make sure everybody's happy. We have to continue to do everything for everyone. No, we don't. We get to set boundaries and we get to control them. Boundary systems are invisible and symbolic. Fences that have three purposes: to keep people from coming into our space and abusing us, to keep us from going in the space of others and abusing them, and to give each of us a way to embody our sense of who we are. And that's from Pia Melody. I don't know if you guys know who that is. But it's very important that we consider the boundaries and what their value is and what they're for. So I have a friend who doesn't use the word boundaries. She told me that she thought the phrase was insulting, and for whatever reason, it did remind her of sitting in a big fenced-in area and her being the only one in there. So instead, she uses the word safeguards. So whatever word works for you, I'm all right and good with. But however you safeguard yourself or make boundaries to make things easier for you, I think you'll find that they're very helpful to you.
Excuse
What
me,
happens-
Hank.
Uh-huh.
Excuse
Yes,
me.
please.
But this is Anna.
Uh-huh.
How would you describe Jesus's life? Would you say he was a people pleaser?
I would not. And if you'll give me about 2 more slides, I'll hit that for you.
Awesome.
All right. So poor boundaries lead to all kinds of different things. Struggling to tell others how you feel because of fear of rejection or ridicule issues. Struggling with feeling burdens of how others view you because we always must be loved and everyone must love us and like us. Strive to make everyone happy with their performance. I think many of my personal issues come out of that because that's the way I grew up. You should be as perfect as possible, which is totally perfect. And you should make all great grades and you should be the best at everything that you do. And if you play a sport, then you need to be really good at it. It's just the way many of us were taught. It's the way our parents wanted the best for us, I genuinely believe. And then that may have pushed some of us to the point of needing to set up boundaries for our own lives. We strive to make everyone happy. Again, we tend to stay in negative relationships because we're afraid we won't find somebody else. That happens often, and we feel trapped, overwhelmed, or manipulated. So when we have poor boundaries and it starts to lead to that, then our boundaries become weaker and weaker. And I'm going to tell you, there's things listed on here like phone calls during meal times. And I always say, I wish I could go back to the rotary phone. Some of you might remember that, depending on your age, where one phone in the house that hung probably in the kitchen, although it might have been in a hallway. And it had a cord so long on it, you could stretch it to almost every room in the house if you had the ability to, and it was so stretched out. and only one person at a time. And then when you got more than one phone in the house, it's still the same line, so you still had other people on it. The only difference was it was more comfortable to talk to people. And I always say that I wish we could go back to that, just because I think we have become so dependent on cell phones and so dependent on constantly and quickly answering every time the blessed thing rings or somebody sends us a text message. Reverend Val Parson at Unity of Melbourne is one of my best friends, and she and I were in Cracker Barrel, and we found something that was called the cell phone gel. And I almost bought one, but it looked kind of like an outhouse. It was just a wooden structure with a top on it, but it had a lock on it, and you open the door. And what you're supposed to do is when you go in to eat with your friends or to talk with your friends, everybody puts their cell phone in jail and then locks it up. I think that's an excellent idea sometimes. And I'm as bad as everybody else in the world about looking at my phone too much, but I do think it would be kind of nice if on occasion we could get back to family time and opportunities for things where we didn't have to always worry about the phone being there. For a long time, not so much now with COVID-19, but in the past, on Friday afternoons, I would just leave my phone in my car. And then I would go back and get it on Saturday afternoon. And people knew if they needed me to call John, they would always find me. But honestly, it was so nice not to think about that phone. The problem was sometimes on Saturday, I'd forget to go get it. And then people were getting a little upset that I wasn't answering them for a couple of days. I'm all right with it. One of the things that we have to be very careful about are toxic people. And boundaries help keep you away from those toxic people. If there's a chance you can do it, then I always say eliminate them, which sounds kind of cruel. But if there is any way that you can avoid toxic people, I encourage you to do that. And if not, build great boundaries around it. Some people you just can't help being around that are toxic. You might work with them. You might be related to them. There are just different ways where we have to be around some toxic people. People who belittle you or bully you. For me, one of my favorite sentences is, I value myself far too much to allow you to speak to me that way. And this is why I'm going to turn around and walk away now. I encourage you to use that one regularly if you deal with toxic people, because it's not worth what it does to your system and your body to listen to that. There was a time when I was on 2 board of directors for 2 nonprofit organizations at the same time. And one of them, I eventually became president of their board. And there was a board member who at every board meeting would slam his keys on the table. If you said something he didn't like, or we were about to vote away he didn't like, he'd just take his keys and slam them down. In addition to acting worse than our 8-year-old, that's just not behavior that should be tolerated. So the first time he did it, I was shocked. I had no clue. The second time he did it, I explained to him afterwards that that was not a professional thing to do and we weren't going to behave that way. The third meeting, I watched him do his hand down to the side where he was about to grab his keys. And before he could pick them up, I looked at him and went, please understand, if you slam those keys on the table, I will accept your resignation and give the keys to the facilities people who will put them back where they belong. Never slammed his keys again. You need to know before you say something like that to someone. In this case, I was very comfortable and supported by every other board member. But sometimes you just have to tell people. Sometimes people are used to being a bully and they don't know anymore. I don't think they even recognize it in themselves. And at that point, then it's time to call them out on it. And that's where you set a boundary. I'm not tolerating this behavior anymore. Other areas, I don't mess with my days off normally. If I'm off, I promise you the university will work just fine without me. There are 14,000 other employees that will handle whatever comes up. When I had my surgery in I had knee replacement surgery last March, and I was out for 8 weeks. And my boss, who grew up in the Center for Spiritual Living, told me she expected me to really take all that time off and not read emails and not answer things. And at one point, she noticed that I had gone in and looked at an email, and I got this text message that said, "You're supposed to be healing. Take care of you. Stop doing work." So some of us really are workaholics. Even when we aren't supposed to be doing it, we do it anyway. So I just encourage you to think through what is best for you and your health. Honor your days off. I think there's a slide later that says figure out what your Sabbath is. Because whatever that is the day you should take care of you and just pay time and attention to yourself. But honor those days off. It's not something like, truthfully, if you leave tomorrow, your company will replace you within a month. Sad but true for every one of us, I expect. So I would just say be careful to use that as and to set that boundary up, that your day off is your day off. Evenings off, I have all my evenings off for the most part, and I don't let a whole lot of things interrupt that. Violation of my personal limits, that's just a no. For years, I would not have enforced that boundary. Now I like my space, and if you get too close to my space uninvited, then I will please tell you to back off, or tell you to please back off. And I don't think, again, that that's being rude. I think that's a boundary that I need to set up and that I need to work with. In work, in your job, I always tell people the biggest boundary you can have is your job description. Make sure that it is well written and that it actually includes what it is you do for a living, and that you don't spend all of your time doing and other duties as assigned. You have to set boundaries at work too, and I found that most of my supervisors have been pretty good about working along with that. And you can kind of work that out. So weak boundaries lead to a lot of unhappiness, unhappy family, damaged relationships. Many of us have been there. So work on those boundaries to keep things going. Unhappy in your workplace, unhappy boss and coworkers, that's never a good thing. Passive problem solving, which means I just kind of let things go for a while, and then suddenly I'm spending all of my time putting out fires because I don't plan, I don't do other things. That's a lack of boundaries. Putting on a good show when you're totally and completely empty on the inside. I'm sure none of us have ever done that. I have learned that people, when they ask you how you're doing, in many cases don't really mean it. You know, I have friends who say, "How are you doing?" and they tell me. Not long ago, I was talking to a friend and I said, "How are you?" And she gave me some lame answer. And I just stopped and said, we were on the phone. I said, "Look, I appreciate that very Christian answer you just gave me. Now, how the hell are you really?" Because I know there's stuff going on in her life, and I know that she just told me all this good stuff that she wanted to say, and great, but that's not what I ask you. I ask you how you are. And with your friends, you can sort of cross that line every now and then. But I wouldn't do that with just anybody. It has to be somebody I know well. But it has no value for us to put on a good show when we're empty inside. Everybody else will know it. Poor self-care will be noticed by everybody. If you were listening Sunday when I spoke, absolutely, at the beginning of this pandemic, my self-care was pretty sorry. If it was available to be eaten, I ate it. And if it needed to be cooked so that I could eat it, I did it. Whatever it took. I stopped meditating, I stopped walking, I stopped exercising. I didn't take care of me. So it was important to get back to that boundary and to set it up and to eventually be back to being who I am. So for most of us, we can rationalize our boundaries. the fun things we say. My lifestyle won't always be like this. I told myself when I was 20 that that was the case, and I was still telling myself that at 50. There's a point where you draw the line. And I tell people all the time, I'm pretty sure my boundaries have gotten stricter as I've gotten older. And that might just be growth and maturity as I get older. God will protect me and my family from my nonstop lifestyle. That's a minister one. This kind of work is my calling. So the job I do, I love. I love the people I work with. I like what I do for a living. I would hope to retire there and doing what I'm doing now. And I will put in extra hours when necessary, but there's still a boundary there. There's a point where you know where what you are doing is getting to be overkill. And with COVID-19, again, I found it really easy for me to do more because office in my house. So it's kind of easy to sit down on a Saturday and start doing something for work. It's easy on a Sunday afternoon to start doing something for work. But reality is no, my boundary says you don't touch your computer for work at that point in time. Accidentally, our IT guy did me such a great favor. He set my computer to VPN only between 8 and 5. So at 5 o'clock, if I'm still on the computer, it'll let me stay. But if it's after 5 and I try to go on the computer or I try to go on Saturday or Sunday, it won't let me in the system. And he doesn't know what a wonderful boundary he set up for me. And I'll eventually tell him. I don't want to tell him now because he might change it. But I'm loving the fact that I can't go in and I can't do those things. So that's really helpful for me. I need to keep everyone happy. My family understands that this is what I love. They'll be fine. No, they won't. I'm not sure that why I'm so tired and stressed. Yes, you do. We know ourselves. We know our bodies. We know what's happening. So that's where the title of the whole boundaries thing came for. Just quit thinking that you're the hero of the world. You are not the world's savior or Messiah. Just slow down, take off your cape. Be you, set boundaries for yourself. For those who may be retired that are tonight, I know at least Dawn is, I'm not sure about others. I have a lot of friends who retire and then go back right into full-time work as volunteers or whatever it is. That's great if it's a work you love. But remember that you retired for a reason, so set some boundaries around that. If your goal was to travel, then how much traveling are you doing? Right now, I get none, but eventually, just live what it was you planned. So don't get too carried away with it. This is my favorite cartoon of all time. And again, I don't know if you can read it. First frame says, "Smile, smite mine enemies, Lord." The second frame says, "Smite my worst enemy with a plague of locusts." And then all the locusts circle his head. So in that frame, he says, let me rephrase that. So basically, let me just say to you, when you take off your cape and you start putting up those boundaries, sometimes you really are going to be your own worst enemy. But learn how to deal with that, acknowledge it, and then move on. Now, Anna, here's the part that you were asking about. So there's a whole set, and I took 3 or 4 of the slides out that talk about boundaries with Jesus. And when we look at the one who is our way shower and our master teacher, Jesus had a lot of boundaries. And one of the ones that I think is most interesting is that he made sure his personal needs were always met. When we read stories, we need to remember that in Scripture, this was an oral tradition that was passed down and taught over and over and over. And the actual writing of it was thousands, in some cases, hundreds and others of years after the event occurred. So they're really oral traditions. And when we look at some of the stories about Jesus, we notice that people are doing things for him. And yet they were always done. So I have to believe that there's some part of him that made sure that he took his naps, that he remained healthy. He did an awful lot of walking, we all know. and he took time to relax. Every time he went to a garden or every time he went to pray, that was relaxation. And I always say, if it's important enough for the one who is our way shower, then it should be important enough for us to do the same. He received support from his friends. He said no to inappropriate behavior, and I'll talk about one of those in just a minute. He used the whip to clear out the temple, and he had a personal prayer time, and he taught that to others. So for me, Jesus wasn't this meek and mild person that we sometimes visualize. If we genuinely believe that Jesus was on this earth as an actualized being eventually, then we know that he was on the same earthly plane that we were on. So a spiritual being living an earthly life, or living on this earthly plane. So I think it's important to remember those. And these are my two favorite of the Jesus stories. Luke 4:28-30 says, all the people in the synagogue were furious when they got up, drove him out of town. This is when he was reading from the scripture and said that he was the Son of God, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. So all these people gathered, all of these people literally encompassed him and took him to the cliff, took him to the edge of the cliff so that they could push him over. And Jesus basically just turned around and walked off. So for me, that's one of the stories that I find important, because sometimes people will take you right up to that cliff, and the best thing you can do is for your boundary to walk off, or the best boundary you can have is to just walk away. Don't allow other people to run your life and to tell you what's going to happen to you. Matthew 12. While Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside, wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. He replied to him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Now, the important part of this story is that next little piece where it mentions that Jesus never went outside to talk to his mom and his brothers. So I don't know what the boundary was about. I don't know what the point of that story necessarily was, other than we're all one and we're all brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers together. But I think it's important to note that even something as important as his family, Jesus had a boundary around. So just a couple of interesting ones for me. And Anna, I don't know if that answered your questions, or if anybody else has any questions at this point.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
There's a good many, and I'll try to put them in for next week.
Okay, thanks. It was very helpful to have those examples. I guess, one tends to think that, since he was a servant to all of us, that I guess I've identified, people pleasing,
Right.
workaholic and all that, being available for others in need all the time, even and since you're always doing it, you don't even know really who you are, what is a boundary for oneself, because you're just always in that role. But so that was very helpful, because obviously he was very much in tune with doing what he needed to do for him.
Right. Good. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions or anything before we go forward?
I'm Jean Marie.
Uh-huh.
Will we be receiving a copy of this? This is my first CCU class.
Okay.
So I don't know if we will be receiving these presentations, these PowerPoints. Can we receive?
I will gladly share them with you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I have everybody's email address. I will be glad to share those. Sure. All right. So when do you create boundaries? Before you start a new job, that's a great time. Before you begin a new relationship, another great time. When you experience a change in your job or relationship. when you have had enough, or when your life is out of balance. Those are some really good times to set up a boundary for yourself. Ideally, we set them up ahead of time, but as we all know, that doesn't always work. So sometimes we need to set the boundaries as we go. So here's some tips on how to do it. Communicate working days and hours. So right now, that's important. There's a couple of slides in here on COVID-19, but right now, it's important that people know what your working days and hours are. I have friends at the university whose managers and supervisors insist that they log in at 8 every morning and that they notify them that they're leaving at 5. I don't work for that sort of manager. My manager knows that I'm doing my job and getting it done well. So she doesn't really care what time I'm doing it. She also, like us, has an 8-year-old. So we have been homeschooling while working from home and doing other things that truly I am not qualified to do, but have been doing just the same, along with, thankfully, a lot of help from the other 2 parents. But reality is, I need to say, this is when I'm working and this is when I'm not. And one of the things that actually I finally saw work today was I've told our son, when you see the headphones on, I'm in a meeting, which probably means I'm on a Zoom with somebody. But today was the first time he walked up to the gate and saw that keep the dogs in, and he saw that I had the headphones on, and he just turned around and walked back. So whatever it takes to set up the boundaries, let people know what your days and hours are. Honor your days off. If you promise your kid you're going to do something, or you promise your partner or spouse you're going to do something, honor that, do it. Define what an emergency is to you. So what is an emergency? What is it that would make you decide that you're going to break a boundary? That's a hard one to do, but I encourage you to think about that. Specify your communication channels. That's another one that seems a little odd, but what it really means is, do you really want your work sending you text messages? Or do you want them sending you, Facebook Messenger messages? How do you want to communicate with other people, especially people in your work life? Tell them exactly what you expect. My boss and I communicate a lot on text, but we're both comfortable with it. So that works for us. If she were to send me something on Facebook Messenger, I think I would probably pass out. Just because we're friends on Facebook, but that's just not how we communicate with each other. And sometimes emails aren't the best thing in the world. But if that is your choice, then you need to let people know that. Track your hours. So that really is something I learned from my current boss. See what it is you do all day. Just take a day or two and write down everything you do at work. Just see what it is you really do. Track your hours and see what you're spending your time on. Use technology wisely. Take a break from technology. Take a break from Facebook every now and then. Right now, the news is mostly depressing to me. So I can only take it in limits. So 15 minutes for me is great for the news right now. And after that, I don't need any more. We have found that with Chase, he asks a lot of questions because he's seeing a lot of the news. So you want to make sure that you're using your technology wisely. Don't check your emails from the office on the evenings and weekends unless you're just that important. If you are, great, go for it. But if not, it's okay. I don't give my cell phone number to an awful lot of people, so I would just say refrain from doing that unless you're comfortable with it. And then we'll talk about how to use calendar blocks in a second. But when you create your boundaries, do it with confidence. You are protecting and honoring yourself when you do it and building your own self-esteem. Be assertive. Learn to say no. Judith Belmont, who's a mental health author and a licensed psychotherapist, said, you have the right to say no without feeling guilty. You have the right to be treated with respect. You have the right to make your needs as important as anyone else's. I have a right to be accepting of my mistakes and failures. I have a right not to meet others' unreasonable expectations. That's not in the slides, but I'll try to include it in the email because I think that's important. And I think it's also important to remember that learning to say no allows you to say yes to something else. So when you say no to one thing, that's giving you an opportunity to yes something else. And some of us have not learned to say no very well. We need to learn to do that. It's taken a lot of practice to be able to say no because again, as I think Tammy, you said, that's that people-pleasing thing where we want everyone happy. We want them to like us. We want everything to be wonderful in the world. So I'll do whatever you ask. Yeah, the answer sometimes is no. Work with your spouse, your partner, your children, whomever you need to maintain your boundaries. If they don't know what they are, they can't help you maintain them. But if they do know, then they can sometimes run interference for you. And then trust your gut. Check in with your body, see how your heart rate's going, see if you're sweating like crazy, tightness in your chest. That probably means you're doing something that would violate a boundary for you. These next two I want to cover kind of quickly so that we can, boundary setting during a pandemic. I got these from Georgetown University's psychology department. Explore your needs and expectations in a mindful manner. Are your expectations on productivity causing stress? Shift your expectations. So again, for some of us, we're doing more at home than we ever did at work because we also have home to deal with while we're here. You don't get the break of leaving. So if it's too much, then shift what's expected. Designate the working hours, office hours. Only discuss work with work colleagues. Lean on your support network, get enough sleep, eat nutritious meals, exercise, take breaks, and remember your self-care. And then this one I just liked. It's helpful phrase on boundaries during the pandemic. It is not helpful for me to talk about the virus pandemic right now. Just be upfront. I need some space to feel and understand my emotions now. It is helpful for me to limit my media coverage to 15 minutes per day. It is helpful for me to limit my time on social media right now. I respect your opinion, but I'm still collecting my thoughts on this situation. I am inspired by your motivation and productivity, but I am prioritizing rest at the moment. I am taking my lunch break or whatever break right now and will respond to you when it is completed. Thank you for your email message. I'll be happy to respond first thing tomorrow, Monday morning. That's one of my personal favorites. So again, don't get so wrapped up into things that you don't honestly get to live and to enjoy life. This is a difficult and stressful enough time. So for each of the classes, I have 2 or 3 different things to suggest on setting boundaries. And these are the 2 for tonight. So I want to look at the one first. It's called the 12-unit schedule, which is actually listed as number 2 on here. So on the 12-unit schedule, what it says to do is to break up your day into 12 units. You'll also see that under that 12 units, I put 10 because honestly, 12 units comes out to 42 hours a day, if my math is right, 42 hours a week. And that would be 2 more hours than I'm generally going to work. So while I may do that many hours, I prefer the 10-unit schedule, which is 35 hours a week. So what you do is you write down everything you do in the week at work. That includes whatever it is, anything. If you smoke, it includes your smoke breaks. If you go to lunch, write down how long you spend at lunch. What's your study time? What's your research time? What is listening to somebody else tell you things time? What is reading all those emails that you get every day at work? Write down everything that you do at work. And if you do it for a few days, you'll see that they start falling into categories. And what this plan suggests is that you then put them into lumps so that every unit is 3.5 hours. So if it takes me an hour to read all my emails, that's going to be 1 hour of one 3.5 unit block. Now, I am not good at this, so I'm just going to tell you that right up front. I have a friend who is brilliant at reading her emails in the morning. She will read them between 8 and 8:30. And if you get your email in early enough, she will read it. If not, she will read them between 4:30 and 5. And she doesn't look at her computer or her emails at any point in time between then. Her job allows her to do that because of what she does. Some of us don't have that kind of job. A lot of what my job is putting out fires around that people come in with at the very last minute. I almost never get what I think I'm going to get done in a day done. But this is a good way to schedule things for yourself. It's a good way to schedule things at home. Just put things into 3.5 hour blocks and then see how they best fit. Where do they best fit in your day so that you're not duplicating effort over and over. It's an easy way to give yourself some boundaries at work. All right, so that's one of the ideas for setting boundaries. The second one is up at the top, the 1 week study. What is most important to you? So this is one of my favorite activities. Some of you have heard me talk about it before, probably. And it's not just good for boundaries, it's just good for life. So here's what you do. Take a piece of paper and write on that piece of paper. To just take some time this week. Take some time after maybe you meditate and are quiet for a little while. And the first page, the question you're answering is, what is most important to you? Of all the things in your life, what is most important to you? So take some time to be quiet. Go into a time of meditation and prayer. Write down what is most important to you. What is most meaningful in your life? So once you get that piece of paper done, just slide it to the side. Take another piece of paper. And now I want you to, for 1 week, so this is a difficult task, write down everything that you do. Anything that you spend time doing during the week, write it down. Now, in this case, I'm not talking about breaks or eating or whatever. Unless you're eating with your family, then I would write that down. But if you're grabbing a sandwich to go or grabbing a Starbucks, probably not the most important thing you want to write down, but maybe you decide what you write down. So first page, what is most important to you? What is most meaningful to you? That's where your values come in again. Look at your values. What matters to you? You should find those things on that first page, telling you exactly what it is that matters to you, what's important to you. Then again, on the next page, you're going to write down everything you do for a week. Okay, so we're on Wednesday night. You can go through maybe next Tuesday, see how it goes. Then you take your two lists and you sit them next to each other and you compare them. So these are the things that matter to me, that are most important to me. These are the things I've just spent a week doing. And see how many of them match. How many things are on your list that you spent your week doing that match what's important to you? So if the things you spend all your time doing are on your list of things that are most important to you, that is great. But if you look at your list and you see that you spent your time doing none of the things that you say truly matter to you, then you have a couple of options. Either they really don't matter and you probably need to change your list, or you need to change what you're spending your time doing. That'll help you figure out where you need to draw boundaries in your life. Questions?
Yes, I'm Jean Marie.
Uh-huh.
And 1 week in the office is much more of a different dynamic than what I am facing. I am teleworking. I'm working from home. And the first 3.5 to 4 or 5 weeks, I was absolutely beside myself. I thought I had forgotten something because I was completing my tasks in a fraction of time. And now at my office, I've been at my job for 25.5 years, and I've always listed things to do for when I didn't have, or when I had more time. And these were things that really didn't matter, but I would like to have gotten them done. So I'm going through those. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because if I make this list for the week that I'm doing now, or should I do it for like what my normal day is like at the office? Which should I?
So I would say it depends on whether or not you're going back anytime soon. Like all of us know that we're not going back until August at the earliest.
Yeah.
So I would do it based on what I'm doing right now.
Okay.
We've been in the same boat. We finished some things early, and then it was like, okay, where's that list of stuff we really wanted to do but never had time? So
Okay.
we've been working through some of them, but that's not going to be reality. And a part of the reality is when you're at work, people are going to talk to you, which you get probably far less of when you're, teleworking. But for the office one, when you're doing like the 10-unit schedule, I would just list everything that you can think of.
Okay.
Not just what you do, but what is it you can think of. For the 1 week study of what's important to you, I probably wouldn't put anything other than work and just a total.
Okay.
Because at work, unless work is extremely important in your life, what you're really looking for is what am I doing with all that other time?
Right. Okay.
What am I spending my time on? What is my extra time other than work going to? I did this for about 2 months in a row, right after somebody introduced me to it. And it was pretty shocking to me what I spent my time doing compared to what I said was important to me,
Okay.
which gave me a chance to rearrange some. Other questions?
Thank you, Hank.
Sure. Any other questions? All right, then. So thank you for tonight. Thank you for being here. We will meet again next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. We're going to look at some practical help for developing boundaries, how to honor the boundaries of others and how to figure out what they are. And then we have 2 exercises we're going to do again. One's called the funeral exercise, and the other's called the sacrificial system. I love the names people give to stuff. And then we'll look at some case studies on boundaries just to see what you think of them. There's no correct answers, just your answers. So if you'll join me now in a closing prayer, and then I will see you next week. So let's join together in prayer. In times of trouble, in times of celebration, we know that all that we need is inside of each one of us. We acknowledge our Christ presence that lives in and expresses in every one of us. We acknowledge that this presence is comfort and calmness and an advocate and intercessor for us. As I move my mind to my heart space, I recognize my inner peace. I claim that fear has no control over me and the decisions that I make. I choose to rest in peace and love and joy. My inner peace brings me calmness and strengthens my courage to face daily challenges. I am peace, I am love, I am joy. And so it is. Amen. And I will see you all next week.